I have another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled Al-Qaeda in the White House and its implications far beyond it, because this isn't just about the President of the United States welcoming in a literal Al-Qaeda terrorist leader into the White House in the United States, in Washington, D.C. It is about what the implications this will all have for U.S. foreign policy. For people who have been paying attention closely for, say, the last 20, 30 years or more, you probably already know where this whole storyline is going. You already know what the U.S. is up to, but for others out there, it might not be so obvious. So let me get into this article. As always, I will add additional information when and if necessary, and I will show you all of the sources that I cited in this article. The link to the article itself will be in the video description below, and in the article there are links that lead off to the sources that I cited while writing it. So, in perhaps 20 years' time, the Western media will reflect back on the radical shifts in narrative surrounding the head of Al-Qaeda in Syria, Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, that is his name, that's what he was known as for years and years, now rebranded and presented as Ahmed al-Sharaa, who recently visited the White House and posed for pictures side by side with an eagerly grinning US President Donald Trump, who was smiling ear to ear, had his arms around him, they were joking, they were playing around. You'd hardly realize that the man President Trump was side by side with had been overseeing the just mass slaughter of not just Christians and Druze, but also fellow Muslims all across Syria and beyond, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. This is what the US created these organizations to do. Everyone always talks about radical Islam. The so-called radical Islam was created by the US to execute US foreign policy around the globe, and their largest targeted victims are actually Muslims, not Christians. Although they do kill Christians, they kill everybody. This is the whole point. Al-Jolani's rebranding follows that of the terrorist organization he nominally heads, because it's not as if he is the leader. He created this organization. The United States created it, and they placed him at the head of it. Most recently referred to as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but also previously known as Jabhat al-Nusra, and of course Al-Qaeda in Syria. And this is what the United States does. It is using these terrorist organizations as proxies to go into where US troops really can't go. And even when US troops are in a nation, say Syria, there are certain things that they cannot actually openly do. So they use these terrorists to do it in their stead. And because they are presented as terrorists, there's really no limit to what they can do, no level of brutality or methods and atrocities that they employ. There's no limit to it because they're terrorists, and the US lists them as terrorists. And even though they're on a terrorist list, the US is actually the ones who created them and are sponsoring them, bringing in weapons and equipment and even training them. And this was all even admitted, and I've covered this for years and years, all throughout the war, the US regime change war targeting Syria, all of these years, finally concluding in the overthrow of the Syrian government late last year, 2024. So this is a game that they play. They have these terrorist organizations that they're using. When people become too familiar with them, they just rebrand them. They rename them, and the general public probably didn't even know the name, the original name of the terrorist organization. They certainly cannot connect the rebrand to the original organization. So this is what allows them to continuously use this tactic of employing literal terrorists while pretending to fight terrorists. The general public just cannot keep up. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, also known as Jabhat al-Nusra, I will refer to it as HTS throughout this article. This was a notorious terrorist organization heading the US-engineered proxy war against the government and military, as well as the people of the now decimated and divided Syrian Arab Republic. And again, the US said, we aren't arming Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. We're sending all these billions of dollars in arms and equipment, literally vehicles. We're sending vehicles, we're training them. We're training the Free Syrian Army, which never actually existed. It never existed. There's no such thing as the Free Syrian Army. It was always Al-Qaeda and ISIS from the very beginning. And just to prove to you that this was planned all the way from the beginning, even though this war in Syria erupted from 2011 onward, ultimately beginning under the Obama administration, preparations for it stretched back years before the Obama administration, all the way back to Bush Jr. This was a article in the New Yorker by legendary journalist Seymour Hersh titled "The Redirection," 2007. To undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shia, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shia organization that is backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam. It is a perversion of Islam. There's nothing that these organizations do that is connected to the Quran. If you actually read it, instead of getting all of your information about Islam from racist idiots on the internet, actually read the Quran yourself. And then you will realize what these racist idiots on the internet are doing, are taking scripts written hundreds of years after the Quran by fake factions of Islam, politically motivated, writing out a complete upturning of everything that Islam was founded on according to the Quran. So go do yourself that favor. If you actually care about the truth, actually go read the Quran. And then when you see these racist idiots on the internet posting quotes they claim came from the Quran, you'll say that was not in the Quran. That is from something written hundreds of years later by a faction of politically motivated interests simply camouflaging themselves with religion, which is exactly what the US itself does today. There's nobody in Washington that's actually Christian. They just camouflage themselves as Christian, because if they showed the American public and the global public what they actually really were and what they stood for and what they were trying to achieve, nobody would support them. Everybody would unite against them. So this is the elites camouflaging themselves in ideology, religion, all kinds of causes to get public support that otherwise would never exist. And this is something that people have done all throughout history, and it continues to this day, and it has targeted every single religion and ideology in human existence, including Islam. So let's get back to this. So a byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, because they are Al-Qaeda. The US was bolstering Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is basically the political arm of Al-Qaeda, and then they were creating what would eventually become the so-called Islamic State, or ISIS. And as a matter of fact, the next part of my article, I say, side by side with the likewise US-sponsored Islamic State, ISIS, HTS openly documented its war crimes spanning the 2011 to 2024 period the US proxy war unfolded, and they're still documenting. They take videos of them slaughtering innocent people because of their race, their religion, their ethnicity. And I say the US-sponsored Islamic State. How do we know the US was behind the Islamic State? How do we know that? Because the US Defense Intelligence Agency admitted it. This is a leaked document courtesy of judicialwatch.org. The link will be in the video description below. And it's one of these documents that, the format doesn't make it very accessible. But if you read all of the text here, here's some quotes. The general situation internally, events are taking a clear sectarian direction. Surprise, surprise. Empire divides and conquers. The Salafist, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Qaeda are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. There's no mention of a moderate Free Syrian Army. It did not exist. The Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States government is admitting that in this paper that was never meant to see public eyes. The West Gulf countries and Turkey support the opposition. The West, meaning the United States and its captured political proxies in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the Five Eyes, especially the European Union. Gulf countries and Turkey support the opposition, while Russia, China, and Iran support the regime. So they're admitting the United States, all of its proxies, support ISIS, well, they say Salafist, and they say Salafist principality. Salafist, Islamic. Principality, state. Salafist principality, Islamic State. They were calling it Salafist principality before it took shape. When it took shape, they decided to brand it as the Islamic State. That is a Defense Intelligence Agency document admitting to all of this. Before it became headline news, this is what they were saying. It gets more obvious than that. Here's another one. If the situation unravels, there's a possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality. This is what I was just talking about. In eastern Syria, which is exactly where ISIS founded its stronghold before ISIS and Al-Qaeda overran the entire country. And this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want. Who are the supporting powers to the opposition? The West, Gulf countries, and Turkey. So that's what they wanted. They wanted a Salafist principality, an Islamic State, to be established. And this is in order to isolate the Syrian regime, which is considered the strategic depth of the Shia expansion in Iraq and Iran. So this was all about, and I've talked about this for years and years, since the 2009 Brookings Institution paper, Which Path to Persia, was published. I talked about how the goal is to isolate Iran. To isolate Iran, you need to also get rid of Hezbollah in Lebanon. You need to weaken and eventually overthrow Syria. You create an air corridor, which you can then go off and bomb Iran directly, which has already happened. Israel and the United States have done this. It also means weakening Iran's influence over Iraq, which has a large Shia population who naturally see Iran as their source of protection. And of course, Yemen. And this is what the United States has been doing for years and years and years. They want to isolate and eventually eliminate Iran. Once they do that, they have effectively total control over the Middle East. They have total control over the Middle East, and the first thing that they will do when they have total control over the Middle East is just cut the hydrocarbons going to China. Because again, zoom out, this isn't about Israel and the US sponsoring a great, they're enslaved by the Israelis and they're being forced to enable Israel to establish a greater Israel over the region. No, zoom out, this is about getting rid of Iran so you can further isolate Russia and China and eventually completely cut off and strangle China altogether. That's what this is about. Always zoom out. Don't become myopically obsessed with the minutia of any one conflict. Empire all throughout human history spans huge amounts of territory. Everything is interconnected. So side by side with the likewise US-sponsored Islamic State, HTS openly documented its war crimes spanning the 2011-2024 period. The US proxy war unfolded. Like I said, they're still documenting it, still videotaping themselves, slaughtering civilians, other Muslims of all kinds, and just anyone who isn't going along with the program. The Alawites, also Muslims, Druze, and of course Christians, ancient Christian communities in Syria that the previous government had protected for decades and decades. Now they're being slaughtered and pushed out of the country. There had been Jewish communities in all of these countries. And then the extremist US has been backing for decades. This didn't just start under President George Bush Jr., with that 2007 Seymour Hersh article. This goes all the way back to the 1980s. They used the Muslim Brotherhood to try to overthrow President Bashar al-Assad's father. This has been ongoing, and it's the same thing. And then the narratives that they try to use to sell it to the public shift, but the underlying strategy is the same. It is continuous, continuity of agenda. By 2025, however, like al-Jolani himself, the terrorist organization he headed, previously featured on the US State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations, was inexplicably removed. And so you have this, US Department of State foreign terrorist organizations. Down here under delisted foreign terrorist organizations, al-Nusra Front, aka Hayat Tahrir, al-Sham, HTS. It was designated a terrorist organization in 2014, but we know the U.S. was backing them as early as 2007 at least, and they were removed July 8th, 2025 by President Donald J. Trump, who's great protector of Christians, and he's going to deal with the radical Muslims, and yet he delisted Al-Qaeda as a foreign terrorist organization, and he's inviting the head of it to the White House. So again, just empty rhetoric used to manipulate the public, who the US government, who Washington, who Wall Street thinks are just infinitely ignorant and will literally believe anything that they say. And sadly, many people do just believe whatever they're told. So they were taken off the terrorist list, and this has happened over and over again. There's another one here, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. This was taken off the foreign terrorist list in 2015, and these were the terrorists that the US used to overthrow the Libyan government in 2011. And then they took Libyan Islamic Fighting Group terrorists and they literally put them on boats and sent them to Syria, unloaded them, and they joined all the other terrorists that they were backing in Syria to go join the fight. Some of these terrorists were also sent fleeing on different parts of the war. Some of them were sent fleeing, and Europe and the United States harbored them. And they knew who they were. They knew that they were terrorists. They knew they were part of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and they just let them out into public. And what did they do when they were out in public? They would carry out horrible terrorist attacks, killing innocent people. And what would the West use this for? They would use it to create this clash of civilizations, this Christianity versus Islam clash of civilization that would allow them to continue gaining public support to fight endless wars in the Middle East to get rid of the evil radical Muslims. That's what they did. So who was behind those attacks? Was it a product of Islam? No, it was a product of Western foreign policy, simply hiding behind the mask of radical Islam. And for people who are familiar with Operation Gladio, during the Cold War, they used right-wing fascists to carry out terrorist attacks all across Europe, and then they blamed it on the communists. Same thing, just same playbook, just change the names a little, change the script a little, keep it fresh, and keep the people playing along at home. The Washington Post, in its recent article, Syrian president meets with Trump in White House after unlikely ascent. There's nothing unlikely about it at all. Anyone who was following this knew this was going to happen, that they would delist them, rehabilitate them, pour huge amounts of support behind them so they could expand the war that they were fighting against Syria toward Hezbollah in Lebanon, toward Iran, and eventually attack Russia, say through the Caucasus region, or even bringing them into Ukraine and sending them into Russia that way now, which they have actually started doing, or attacking China's Belt and Road Initiative. I'll get into that a little bit later. I mentioned that in the article. So the Washington Post is talking about an unlikely ascent. Nothing unlikely about it, unless you just believe the fantasies that the Western media and Western politicians tell you. Ahmed al-Sharaa, also known as al-Jolani, the rebel leader who became Syria. He's not a rebel leader, he's a terrorist. He was head of a terrorist organization who became Syria's president after ousting Bashar al-Assad, has walked an improbable path from Al-Qaeda to the West Wing. Is it really improbable? Not so much. In reality, this was an entirely probable, even inevitable outcome, considering the history of US state sponsorship of terrorism, Al-Qaeda in particular, and the circular pattern depicting the terrorist front as both freedom fighters and villains, spanning decades of US proxy wars and outright wars of aggression from Afghanistan in the 1980s to Syria today, and to China and Russia's periphery, Iran and Hezbollah tomorrow. So we're going to talk about as in the past, so too in the present. And when you see this, you will realize how absurd this headline from the Washington Post. It's so unlikely. We've never seen anything like this happen before. Let me just show you this. A lot of people are probably familiar with this. Anti-Soviet warrior puts his army on the road to peace. You remember. The US was behind Al-Qaeda's inception, and they used them to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. And they completely whitewashed Osama bin Laden. He was a freedom fighter. He was an anti-Soviet warrior. And then he went from freedom fighter to villain. And now we have al-Jolani going from villain to freedom fighter. So again, it's circular, sometimes mirrored, but it is a circular pattern. Just constantly repeats itself because people don't do the research, they don't connect it. They have very short memories, and you can just why come up with new lies when you could just reuse the same ones and they're just as effective? Short memories are shocked by recent developments, but considering the trajectory of another infamous Al-Qaeda leader, Osama bin Laden, recent developments seem as natural as the sun rising and setting daily. In the 2013 Business Insider article, this was published in 2013. It's titled, "This Mind-Boggling Profile of Osama bin Laden Came Out Exactly 20 Years Ago Today." Let's take a look at the headline again. It's so mind-boggling that the West would portray vicious terrorists as freedom fighters, except it's not mind-boggling because they do it all the time. This is what the Business Insider said. The article from December 6, 1993 by Robert Fisk of The Independent with the title "Anti-Soviet Warrior Puts His Army on the Road to Peace" is stunning to consider 20 years later. Osama bin Laden, fresh off the US-backed Mujahideen victory over Russia, so they're even admitting the US was completely behind Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan fighting the Soviets, in 1989, flew his men, materials, and money down to Sudan, another place the US is completely involved in. All of the horrors, atrocities, and violence the US is driving all of it, to start public works projects. Then it notes, the piece is fascinating because it is a positive profile of a man who would become a global terrorist mastermind. Is it fascinating? Is it unique? Or is it just the same thing the West constantly does? So now we have a listed terrorist with a $10 million bounty on his head from the US government heading a listed terrorist organization. Now he's in the White House. Now he's hanging out with President Donald Trump. So no, it's not fascinating, it's not surprising, it's not mind-boggling. It's par for the course, really. Anyone that is paying attention has a long memory. Al-Jolani's career mirrors that of Osama bin Laden. Just as a mirrored reflection shows a similar but reverse reflection, Al-Jolani has gone from a terrorist mastermind with a $10 million bounty on his head. Again, the US government only recently withdrew that. Right here. BBC, US scraps $10 million bounty for arrest of Syria's new leader, Sharaa, again, also known as Al-Jolani. He is a terrorist on the US listed terrorist organization, HTS. They delisted the terrorist organization. They took the bounty off his head because they're done using this organization they created for this particular purpose. Now they have another purpose for it. Now it's time to rehabilitate its image. Just like they built up this image of these freedom-fighting mujahideen in Afghanistan, and then they transformed them into evil villains for another purpose, for triggering the war on terror that would span 20 years, actually continues to this day, 25 years. They're still using the impetus that started the war on terror in the first place, the terrorist attacks on 9/11. If you believe the official narrative, carried out by a terrorist the US built up and backed throughout his entire career until he just suddenly went rogue. And then when he went rogue, he's just created this perfect pretext for a war the US was already planning to fight years in advance. So now he's an open ally in America's continued war for primacy over the Middle East and beyond. That's what they're going to use Al-Jolani and Al-Qaeda in Syria for, this continued war of primacy over the Middle East the US is fighting. Just as Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were originally created and sponsored by the United States government to wage proxy war against its designated adversaries, including the Soviet Union, and then later against the Russian Federation. By that I mean the US was backing Al-Qaeda and other terrorists in the Chechen wars inside Russian territory. Vicious, protracted wars inside Russia. and a campaign of terrorist attacks all across Russia, not just in the Caucasus region. And then also China, particularly in Xinjiang. This was, again, another faction of Al-Qaeda the US created and was backing. They were slaughtering hundreds, thousands of people in Xinjiang, Western China, and then the violence spread across all of China. Then the violence spread across all of Asia. There was a terrorist attack here in 2015 carried out by Uyghur terrorists backed by the US. And then thousands and thousands of them went to Syria to go fight this US-backed regime change war against the Syrian government. I will get to that here in just a minute. So just as Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were created and sponsored by the US government to wage proxy war against its designated adversaries, including Soviet Union, China, and their partners, al-Jolani and Al-Qaeda today, along with ISIS and other extremist organizations, have been and will continue to be used to wage proxy war or serve as a pretext for actual war against Russia, China, and other nations investing in a multipolar future. And I've covered for years and years the US almost like flipping a switch in the Philippines when President Duterte wanted to oust the US military from the Philippines. Just like that, Al-Qaeda ISIS actually just suddenly showed up in southern Philippines. They took over an entire city, just suddenly, out of nowhere. Which, if you understand about military matters, that's impossible. There's all kinds of logistics and planning that's required to do this. It happened, and then as it happened, the US said, are you sure you want to kick us out of the Philippines? Looks like you got a little bit of a problem down there. And it might get bigger and bigger the longer you go on about us getting kicked out. And so what happened was the Philippines had no choice but to allow the US to remain. They destroyed the city. The US helped to stop something that they themselves started. And this is what the US uses Al-Qaeda and other extremist organizations to do. Let's talk about the big picture. Syria as an epicenter for exporting US-sponsored terrorism. Again, people are myopically obsessed with the Middle East and Israel in particular. They think this all has to do with Israel. They cannot zoom out and see the big picture and see what the US is doing for its own interests and how it's using everyone, including Israel, in the region to achieve this, and how it goes far beyond the region. It has nothing to do with, oh, we're just obsessed with helping Israel. Everything else is on the periphery. No, this is just one small part of a much larger global strategy the US is pursuing. It is abundantly clear the US will continue backing al-Jolani and the terrorist network, now posing as Syria's new armed forces, not to defend Syria, to defend them from what? To defend them from Syria reverting to an actual sovereign state, to throw off the US as their overseers, but to continue the fight against US targeted nations and organizations across the region, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, and even Iran itself. The US will also seek to export Syrian-based extremism far beyond the region, including all along Russia's and especially China's peripheries. And we saw this in Libya. The US used Al-Qaeda to overthrow the government in Libya, and when they were done doing that, they began rehabilitating some of these groups, sending them to Syria to go participate in that regime change operation. They also continued this flow of weapons and material support that allowed these extremists to spread all across northern Africa and all the way over to West Africa, places like Nigeria where the United States now is talking about military intervention to protect Christians from extremists the US itself created, armed, and allowed to spread across Africa in the first place. Again, same playbook, reused all around the globe. It is not about just the Middle East or about Israel. Among al-Jolani's extremist forces includes the so-called Turkestan Islamic Party, TIP, also known as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. Again, you just create 10 different names and you have the media take turns using all of these names. The general public will never be able to put all of them together. They will not remember that TIP is also ETIM. They will not remember that. TIP, ETIM, was also disingenuously removed from the US Foreign Terrorist Organization list in 2020, specifically to provide it with wider and more overt support. And again, vis-a-vis China. And here, A Guardian article from 2020, US removes shadowy group from terror list, blamed by China for attacks. There's nothing shadowy about it. The TIP or ETIM, State Department says there's no credible evidence it exists. And they said, although going back 10 years, there's no evidence it still exists, except that was 2020, 2018, so just 2 years prior. So well within the 10-year mark, they said they have no evidence exists. The US was literally bombing these terrorists in Afghanistan. And so they removed them from the terrorist list, not because they don't exist anymore, but because they absolutely do exist, and they want to more overtly back them and sponsor them to ramp up the war that they are already waging by proxy against China. And again, I've talked about this for years and years, and I will get into it here in this article here in just a moment. So they removed them from the terror list despite knowing full well they still exist and they're still terrorists. They have now removed HTS, al-Nusra from the terrorist list, knowing that they're absolute horrible terrorists, still mass murdering people all across Syria, knowing that al-Jolani has not reformed himself in any shape, form, or way, but they are ready to use their own terrorists they created and pretended to oppose. Now they're ready to work openly with them to advance their agenda even further. So DW in its article, this article right here, US removes China-condemned group from terror list, again, under the first Trump administration. So again, it wasn't an anomaly that President Trump just now delisted Al-Qaeda in Syria. His first and second administration, they both have now done this. And the Obama administration has done this. And the Biden administration has done this. They all do this. So again, continuity of agenda. Doesn't matter who you vote for. This is what you get when they get into office. So the article, the DW article, US removes China-condemned group from terror list, would claim TIP-ETM was removed as a terrorist organization by the US government because for more than a decade, so 10 years, there has been no credible evidence that ETIM continues to exist. This, however, is untrue. The US Department of Defense, now the Department of War, again, for people who think the US is retreating from its pursuit of primacy worldwide and that it seeks coexistence with a place within the multipolar world, they're renaming the Department of Defense to the Department of War for a very specific and extremely obvious reason. The Department of Defense admitted to having carried out airstrikes against the group in Afghanistan only 2 years prior to its delisting. And that's, again, as NBC News reported. All of these articles, all of the links to them are in the video description below. East Turkestan Islamic Movement, right there. It's right there. And so they're lying. They're lying to you about why they're delisting them. What is the truth? The truth is they want to sponsor them more openly, more broadly, more intensively. This is just one of many instances of US narratives and who it designates as terrorists changing based solely on what advances US foreign policy, not any sort of actual metric based on national or even international peace and security. Now, the organization the US government claims no longer exists. So again, remember, in 2020, they delisted ETIM, TIP-ETIM. They delisted it in 2020, saying it doesn't exist. Now the Western media is saying thousands and thousands of fighters belonging to this terrorist organization that the US says no longer exists, that's why they delisted it, they're now in Syria. So let's get into these Uyghur extremists the US created, used in China. China uprooted them. The US moved thousands and thousands of these extremists to Syria to help in the regime change war there. That war is now over. What are they going to do with these thousands and thousands of Uyghur extremists originally from China? Now the organization the US government claims no longer exists is in Syria and constitutes an entire military unit alongside al-Jolani's HTS, having aided in the overthrow of the Syrian government late last year, again, late 2024. Since then, it has announced ambitions to expand its operations far beyond Syria. So again, exactly what the US-backed terrorists in Libya did after overthrowing the government there. The US then used them. Some of them they delisted and rehabilitated the image of. Others remained as extremists, the US continued backing all of them, and they spread extremism far beyond Libya to Syria and all across the rest of Africa. And now they will do the same thing in Syria. This is what they always do, and it's obvious that's what they're doing. And the Western media is telling you that's what they're doing. So the London Telegraph, in a December 13, 2024 article titled, "Uyghur Fighters in Syria Vow to Come for China Next." How convenient. The US now wants to focus on China as well. What a coincidence. And it claims a Uyghur militant group that helped to topple Bashar al-Assad has vowed to take the fight to China. Again, a militant group the US delisted because it said it doesn't exist anymore. And so here's the Western media telling you just 4 years later, no, they actually do exist, and there's thousands and thousands of them. There's a whole army of them, and they're in Syria. Again, the Turkestan Islamic Party, also known as ETIM, says its main mission to liberate the Muslims of East Turkestan, which does not exist, from the Chinese occupation. East Turkestan is what US-backed terrorists and separatists call Xinjiang, China. Xinjiang is recognized under international law as part of China. It is a part of China. There is no such thing as East Turkestan. This is a name made up by the US, and this campaign to carve it off of the rest of China. And if you look at a map, Xinjiang is where much of China's land routes that it's trying to use to circumvent an impending US maritime blockade. It is a region of China that these land routes go through. So if you were to carve it off, you would cut off a significant portion of the Belt and Road Initiative, where it originates and passes through inside China to go to all of these other places China would seek to reach if it couldn't do so by sea. The ability to do so, to take the fight to China, is only possible with continued US government backing, including training, weapons, and logistics via regional proxies, including Turkey, who prepared and incorporated the militants in the invasion force that toppled Syria's government in the first place. The US is also clearly rehabilitating the terrorist organization, its HTS partners, as we just mentioned, and HTS's leader, al-Jolani himself, who was literally in the White House recently, both enabling greater, more open support from the US for these terrorist attacks and enabling the US to condemn any measures China and its Belt and Road Initiative partners attempt to take to stop it. So if you rehabilitate these organizations and you say, no, these are good guys now, they're freedom fighters, they helped us in Syria, and they just want peace and freedom, and they want to free all of their brothers and sisters in East Turkestan, which is actually Xinjiang, China, when China and its partners react to the terrorism that the US is already carrying out against them, the US will say, see, look at China attacking these poor, innocent, aspiring freedom fighters. China is bad. China's partners are bad, and they will use that to put pressure on them. This is what they have already done regarding the terrorism the US sponsored inside Xinjiang itself. They said China's carrying out a genocide by stopping admitted widespread off the charts terrorism taking place in Xinjiang. So they'll do that again too. They reuse all of these processes over and over again because they work and people never catch on to them. Short of fighting in China itself, the Telegraph in its accompanying video would note, and so this is a quote from the video, can TIP take the fight to China, home of the world's largest military with 2 million active troops? Probably not. It's easier said than done. Still, TIP could target Chinese projects or embassies abroad, which is just blatant terrorism. It's literally terrorism, but the Telegraph never depicts it as terrorism. And the US will not depict it as terrorism. They will depict it as fighting against evil China, and all of these things are justified, just like they did all along in Syria from 2011 to 2024. These terrorists sawing people's heads off, lighting people on fire, killing men, women, and children deliberately, openly. And the US would say, well, they're just fighting against the evil dictatorship of President Bashar al-Assad, and so this is what they have to do. And if it gets really bad, they'll say, well, those are terrorists, but they're separate from the moderates that we're backing, the moderates that don't actually exist. So there's many different ways they can deal with this, depending on how they become cornered in their own narratives. So the Telegraph says TIP could target Chinese projects or embassies abroad. What if I told you they're already doing this? What if I told you US-backed terrorists are already doing this all along the Belt and Road Initiative outside of China itself? So this fits into an already ongoing US-sponsored terrorist campaign of targeting Chinese BRI projects across Eurasia, including in Baluchistan, Pakistan, that's southwest Pakistan, called Baluchistan, and in Southeast Asia's nation of Myanmar. So let's take let's take an example of that. First of all, from all the way back in 2011, as the US was preparing to overthrow and plunge the Arab world into chaos under the US engineered so-called Arab Spring. This is an article published in the National Interest called Free Baluchistan, and it's long, but cut to the chase. Pakistan has given China a base in Gwadar, in the heart of Baluch territory, so an independent Baluchistan, and of course by that they mean backing US-based Baluchistan terrorists to carve off Baluchistan from Pakistan, would serve US strategic interests. And then they say, in addition to the immediate goal of countering Islamic forces. But of course, you're arming and backing terrorists, so how are you countering terrorists? Which is what they mean by Islamic forces. They mean terrorists, and these terrorists often have nothing to do with actual Islam. We're going to create terrorists to fight terrorists, but what he's actually admitting in that last sentence is it has nothing to do with fighting terrorism. That's just what we're using as a pretext. This is all about stopping China and its Belt and Road Initiative, which includes the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which Gwadar Port is a part of. That's where the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor starts in Gwadar, and it goes all the way up to northern Pakistan to the border with China. That's Pakistan, and every single year there are attacks by these US-backed terrorists against Chinese engineers working on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the Pakistani security forces trying to protect them. What about Myanmar? Again, every single year there are these attacks. Chinese facilities and enterprises are increasingly being caught in the crossfire of the struggle between the PDS, which these are the US-backed militants and terrorists that they're trying to use to overthrow Myanmar's government, and the Tatmadaw, which is the Myanmar military. So an army of well-trained, well-armed, experienced terrorists, fresh from the battlefield in Syria and now being recognized and more openly backed by the US directly, are poised to significantly escalate what it is already a US war on China by proxy along the length of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, and ultimately aimed at China itself. So they already have terrorists in Myanmar, in Pakistan, in other places. They've carried out attacks here in Thailand. They're already waging a proxy war against China. The US is already killing Chinese people. The terrorists in Baluchistan, the US backs, tried to kill the Chinese ambassador to Pakistan at one point. Okay, so it's serious. And I've mentioned this before. If the US could just fly a fleet of B-52s over BRI projects and just carpet bomb them, they would, but they can't do that. So what they're doing instead is backing armed terrorists to attack and destroy them as an alternative. That's what they've been doing for years and years. You see it goes all the way back to 2011 in regards to Pakistan. It's been going on for years and years in Myanmar, and even here in Thailand, they haven't started carrying out physical attacks on joint Thai-Chinese infrastructure like the high-speed rail line that's under construction. But they have had US-backed opposition parties demanding that the construction halt and the project be canceled. So the US is using a multitude of ways to strangle and cut off the Belt and Road Initiative, including just physically destroying it, while they're using their military posture in Asia Pacific to set up what will eventually be an imposed maritime blockade to strangle China, to strangle its import of essential materials for its industry, for energy, and also to block it from sending exports out, to strangle it economically, essentially. And that's what this is a part of, backing these terrorists, building them up, getting them battle-hardened in Syria so they can deploy and attack Belt and Road Initiative projects all across Eurasia. That's what this is all a part of. Again, you have to zoom out and see the big picture. So an army of well-trained, well-armed, experienced terrorists, fresh from the battlefield in Syria, and now being recognized and more openly backed by the U.S. directly, are poised to significantly escalate what is already a U.S. war on China by proxy along the length of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative and ultimately aimed at China itself. This, in turn, fits into a long-standing U.S. global policy of eliminating all rivals through persuasion, coercion, sanctions, U.S.-sponsored sedition, terrorism, and military confrontation by proxy and directly. And I always go to this article because this is first principles. This is what drives all U.S. foreign and domestic policy. U.S. strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop American hegemony over the entire planet. The U.S.'s rejection of collective internationalism, now known as multipolarism. This article is from all the way back in 1992, the end of the Cold War. And this is what has driven U.S. foreign policy from then all the way until now. And it is the policy that drives all empire throughout human history. The U.S. empire is no exception. That is what we're actually watching. This is why I say you need to zoom out and see the big picture of what the U.S. does instead of getting sucked into the minutia of any one particular spot on the map, the huge global map the U.S. is working on as a whole. The fall of Syria and other nations like it contribute toward a more dangerous world where larger and more stable nations may be targeted, undermined, and toppled next. Again, the Brookings Institution paper, Which Path to Persia, talks specifically about how eliminating Syria is a prerequisite towards cornering, encircling, containing, and toppling the government of Iran. And we have seen, as soon as Syria began collapsing, the US and Israel targeted their integrated air defense systems, created an air corridor to Iran, and they immediately used it to attack Iran directly. The US used Israel as a proxy to start the war, and then the US waded in and did so directly afterwards. As I warned for years, as I warned literally 24 hours before it took place, when many others were saying, no, President Trump wants peace with Iran. He's the peace president. He's fighting the deep state. He'll never go along with a deep state war against Iran. Well, he did. And it was painfully predictable. And it's only on pause. It will restart as soon as the US feels it is ready to do so. Going beyond counterterrorism to preempt US aggression, if you find yourself running around reacting to US-sponsored terrorism all along your periphery or even within your country yourself, you have already failed. There are ways to preempt this that you need to be serious about enacting. But so far, whether it's out of an inability to or out of not knowing that it needs to actually be done, Russia and China have really failed at doing this so far. We could only hope that they develop a strategy to eventually do this. Among the most effective and so far unanswered weapons the United States government wields is its dominion over global information space and its global spanning network of political interference and capture centered around the National Endowment for Democracy and subsidiaries and adjacent government and corporate funded foundations. People try to, because they themselves are married to some sort of political party or ideology, they try to separate George Soros's Open Society from the NED or the International Republican Institute or the National Democratic Institute, because they don't want to imagine that President Donald Trump is actually working with Soros. I mean, it's obvious. He has Scott Bessent in his administration as the Secretary of Treasury. He was the right-hand man of George Soros. In his first administration, he had Steve Mnuchin, also heading one of George Soros's funds. So do you spot a pattern here? He may pretend he hates George Soros, but it's all an act. He's working together with some of George Soros's most senior partners, people who worked and still do work with him, and in parallel with everything George Soros himself claims he stands for and is trying to achieve. Russian and Chinese military and economic power continues to rise, and both nations have successfully protected their respective information spaces from US interference or capture. They've done a very good job of doing that. It took some time, but they did it. They managed to do it. However, the US continues unopposed, I would say almost completely unopposed, undermining nations all along both Russia and China's peripheries, politically capturing nations and transforming them into political and even military battering rams against both targeted nations, even nations right on Russia or China's borders. The US has managed to completely politically capture and then transform into a national security threat, even an existential threat to nations like Russia and China. Syria's collapse in the first place, it did not begin with this war that erupted in 2011. The way they set the stage for that was by infiltrating Syria's political and information space, building up these opposition groups, which then transformed into these armed groups that eventually and successfully overthrew Syria late last year. So Syria's collapse in the first place began through a decades-spanning process of politically undermining Syria's previous government and through the US-sponsored rise of opposition groups, including armed terrorist groups. I showed you the 2007 New Yorker article by Seymour Hersh talking about the Bush Jr. administration doing this, setting the stage for the Obama administration and everyone after that to follow. So Syria's collapse in the first place began through a decade-spanning process of politically undermining Syria's previous government and through the US-sponsored rise of opposition groups, including armed terrorist groups funded by the Central Intelligence Agency, up until the 1980s when the NED assumed many of the CIA's regime change roles. So the CIA was in there doing it, and then the CIA continued overseeing certain aspects of it, but then the NED came in and they took over a lot of this, not just in Syria, but all around the globe. The NED is involved absolutely everywhere, except where the US already, without question, completely controls, like the US itself, obviously, and most of Western Europe, places like Australia. The NED is not really active. They have other organizations, agencies, and networks that they use to maintain control. They're already captured, and now they have networks maintaining control over them. While China may have successfully uprooted US-sponsored extremism in Xinjiang, which is Western China inside China's borders, the US continues arming, backing, and promoting the same extremists out of China's reach in recently decimated Syria, and even closer to home in neighboring Pakistan and Myanmar. So the US built up a terrorist army inside China that China did for years struggle to contain, but they successfully did it. But now the US is building up armies of terrorists out of reach of where China can repeat that success. They cannot do that in Myanmar. They cannot do that in Syria. They cannot do that in Pakistan. Pakistan and Myanmar border China, and they cannot do it. So that is a serious problem. Through Washington's control over information space outside of China, and the political capture and control this grants the US, these terrorists are being created, backed, positioned inside targeted or captured nations, and then presented as freedom fighters in much the same way the US has presented HTS and decades before the anti-Soviet warrior Osama bin Laden. See the pattern? And do you see how it will continue into the future? Can you extrapolate from what has happened over and over again in the past in terms of US foreign policy and using extremists to advance that policy? Can you extrapolate from that what the US will now use these terrorists in Syria to now go do around the globe today and into the future? Russia and China aid partner nations in the defense of their traditional national security domains. That means Russia and China sell warplanes to defend their partner nations' airspace, air defense systems to do likewise, tanks, rifles, all kinds of armored vehicles, artillery, rockets, and missiles to protect their land borders, warships, submarines to protect their coasts. They do that, but they have failed, I would say almost entirely, to export their own domestic success in securing a 21st century national security domain, information space. I've said it over and over again. Do not separate information space from air, land, and sea. Information space in the 21st century now constitutes one of these national security domains. If you're leaving your information space unprotected, if you're not even recognizing it as a national defense domain, It's like just leaving your land border completely open, not even having a land army in existence to protect your borders, or having not even a single ship in your navy, or having no means at all to defend your airspace. That is what it is like. And if you are not defending your physical national security domains, any nation that wants is going to be able to overwhelm you by force. And if you leave your information space, national security domain wide open, completely unprotected, the US is going to come in and take it over. And then from there, they will take over your entire country. They have done it repeatedly. Just this year, they took over Nepal, using Nepal's unprotected information space. And as a matter of fact, the US-sponsored regime change was triggered by Nepal trying to rush and secure its information space. And the US said, no, 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 you're not doing that. We're gonna move now, and we're going to just topple your government. And now half of the interim government is made up by NED-funded proxies. Should Russia and China succeed in doing this, if they can succeed in coming up with a way to export the means to defend information space in their partner nations, just like they export physical weapons to defend their physical national security domains. If they're able to do this, Washington will be denied one of its last and most effective weapons used to sustain global hegemony, greatly reducing or even eliminating the US's ability to build armies of global spanning terrorists, upending peace and stability, and making multipolarism inevitable rather than a mere possibility. Because I would say at this point, it is still just a possibility. I do not believe multipolarism is necessarily inevitable. Maybe in the distant future, yes, but in terms of what is going on right now, people look at what's going, again, they myopically focus on Ukraine and they say, look, the US cannot build enough weapons to back the Ukrainians and overwhelm the Russians are making way more weapons. Surely between Russia and China, they can all make many more weapons than the US, and in any armed conflict, they will succeed. Except it's not true, because the US already won an armed conflict with Russia in Syria. And I know a lot of people are coping out there. They don't want to face the reality that Russia was overextended and too weak to protect both its interests in Syria and what it's doing in Ukraine. It had to pick one because it wasn't strong enough to do both. So it picked Ukraine, and Syria collapsed. And that is because there are serious limits to what Russia and also to what China can achieve. Despite all of their advantages, they still suffer from serious disadvantages. And despite the obvious disadvantage the US has in terms of military industrial production, it makes up for it. And its geopolitical agility to move all around the globe in ways Russia and China simply can't. They can project military power anywhere, even if it's weaker. The military power is weaker, more diluted. They can move it around in ways Russia and China cannot respond. And this super weapon they have to politically infiltrate and capture nations, even right on the borders of Russia and China. And Russia and China being able to do virtually nothing to stop this so far. That is an incredible advantage that they have that makes up for their disadvantage in terms of military industrial production, which is something that they're working on right now. Will they catch up with Russia and China? It doesn't look like they will, but they will expand their military industrial production. They will expand military capabilities in other areas, and they will continue focusing on this super weapon that they have that Russia and China so far have no answer to. So that's where the article ends. And that's the takeaway of this article and my work in general is please do not focus on just one conflict. Zoom out and see the big picture. Please do not focus just on one advantage multipolarism has and just one disadvantage the US empire has. Make two columns and list all of the strengths and weaknesses that you can think of, and then add it up that way. And then it doesn't look as lopsided as it might seem if you're just looking at military industrial production. And that's what analysis is really all about. It's not about what you wish was happening. I wish that multipolarism was inevitable, that it's already unfolding, and the US stands no chance at reversing it or disrupting it or slowing it down. But in reality, the facts add up differently. And it says the US still poses a huge threat to multipolarism in every nation that is seeking to invest in it. And we are watching that danger unfold in places like Syria, now completely decimated. Countries like Nepal, now politically captured by the US, right on China's doorstep. I'm in Southeast Asia. I watch US influence and political capture expanding year by year, and I see no one really doing anything serious to even expose it, let alone stop it. This is a huge problem. This is a full spectrum war for dominance over the planet that the US is pursuing, and in order to counter it, to defend yourself against it, you need a full spectrum defense. You cannot just focus on military industrial production. You also need to look into all the other domains the US is using to pursue primacy, and you need to put up resistance there as well. You need to overcome them in these other domains as well. And so when I say exporting the means to defend information space, people say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, Russia and China have their own social media platforms, whereas the whole rest of the world depends on US-based social media platforms that use algorithms that are designed specifically to enable US political influence and capture. The US was working with Facebook and Twitter during the Arab Spring. They admit this. This is what allowed them to do this. These countries had no control over their information space. The US completely controlled it, and they completely shaped what the populations, what they could see, what they were thinking, what they thought they were fighting for. All of this was controlled by the US through the State Department. And these opposition groups, they built up years in advance, and they're still doing that today. So a country like Thailand, they need their own social media platform. They need to create an alternative to Facebook, to Instagram, to all of these social media platforms that the US is using to influence public perception inside Thailand. When you build up these alternatives, you can then tell Facebook and X and all of these other US-based social media platforms, we have laws that you need to comply with. And if you don't comply with them, we will kick you out. We have our own social media platforms that can fill the void. Right now, they don't have their own social media platforms to fill the void. So when they say, we'll kick you out, they just laugh in their face and they say, if you kick us out, there is no alternative, and the people will turn on you, which is exactly how we set it up deliberately. That's one thing Russia and China can do, working with these partner nations, create these alternatives to US social media platforms that the US uses to politically capture and control public perception all around the globe. You can also help nations create or reform their education system to create pipelines where you take students who want to work in journalism or want to work in policymaking or government administration. You create a pipeline where they go through education inside that country, and they learn how to do these jobs in a way that serves the best interests of that country. What do they do right now in Thailand? Where do they go? When you want to be a journalist, you go to the United States, you go to Europe, and you study journalism. You become indoctrinated, you come back. You're now plugged into a personal and professional network of Western journalism. And then when news pops up and it's your turn to start covering it, you're just going to automatically, out of your desire to preserve your status within those professional and personal networks, you're just going to repeat the Western narrative. You're not going to repeat the truth, because if you do, you'll be ostracized. I've seen this happen at different junctures when the US is applying pressure on Thailand, when they have groups out in the streets, journalists that try to tell the truth or start digging into who's behind the protests. You watch the white Westerners in Thailand representing, say, the BBC, put pressure on them and essentially say, you'll be ostracized. You're a conspiracy theorist. You're not going along with the narrative you're supposed to. I know journalists here, and Thai journalists here, that are regularly invited to US Embassy, UK Embassy, European Embassy parties and celebrations and events. They're very posh, and this is a real boost for their own starving ego and makes them feel really, really important. Do you think someone that accepts those invitations and goes to these parties and then shows off that they're at these parties on their social media, do you think for a moment, if they see something the US or Europe is doing negative in Thailand, they will report it and risk not getting an invitation to the next celebration? Not a chance. Not a chance. And so you need to create a pipeline and a group of people inside your country that represent your best interest, not people that have gone overseas and now have come back representing somebody else's interest. So social media, platforms indigenous to that country. Maybe Russia and China can help. They have experience creating these platforms. Educational pipelines that create the human resources you need to protect your sovereignty, to run your country in a sovereign manner, not exporting your youth to another country and having them come back as representatives of a foreign effort to administer and direct your country. And of course, very obviously, NGO transparency laws force these NGOs that are taking foreign money to disclose where their money is coming from. Or even better yet, ban them. You're taking foreign money from a foreign government. How are you a non-governmental organization if a foreign government is funding you and directing your actions? Then you're not a non-governmental organization. You're a foreign government organization. And you should be treated as such. And these groups need to be removed from a targeted country. And that country needs to create legitimate non-governmental organizations that will actually and genuinely pursue the best interests of the people in that country. You know, civil society, real civil society, has a role to play in any nation, but it cannot do that if it has been captured or created from whole cloth by a foreign nation, and it is being used as a method of taking over that country rather than serving the interests of that country. So these just 3 ideas right there that if Russia and China helped other nations do, maybe as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they already set up an information security center. Are they going to work on things like this? I don't know. Haven't seen any details about it. Could they help prepare for the backlash? Anytime a government announces some sort of NGO law, all the NGOs funded by the US government, they're going to come out from under their rocks, and they're going to create turmoil in the streets. They'll try to turn the country upside down to stop this from happening. Because if you cut the money, then the opposition will shrivel up and blow away. And they know that. Russia and China prepare a country, work with a country to help them, prepare them, give them assurances, give them alternatives when they're faced with sanctions and other restrictions and punishments from the West for passing an NGO law. Work with them so that they can do it successfully. Nobody did that for Nepal, or if they did, they failed completely. And the whole country was overrun by US-backed mobs and proxies. I understand. You look at the headlines day to day and you see these wars, and this is what grabs people's attention. This very slow process of insidiously reaching into a country, politically capturing it and overturning it takes years, sometimes decades to do. People hardly even notice it's happening. When you talk about it, nobody wants to listen. But ultimately, the outcome of doing that is this. This is the outcome. This was the outcome for Syria. This is what has happened to Syria. That is the ultimate outcome of this insidious, yes, boring, but insidious and very effective process of politically capturing a country. It will lead to attention-grabbing headlines for wars, and then it will end in a politically captured country like Syria, whose future is now in absolute doubt, and the region's future is now in absolute doubt. I will leave it there. There's so much more to cover. I will continue covering all of these topics in future articles and videos. If you thought this one was useful, please like and share. In the video description below will be all the other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos go up on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Telegram. In the video description below, again, will be all of the links to everything that I cited, including this Neo article that I wrote. Also in the video description below will be ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip or block them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no additional resources and you're just helping by liking, sharing, sending news tips, that is all greatly appreciated. All of that together is what makes this work possible. I thank you sincerely for all support in any form. And as always, thank you for watching.